Welcome. My name's Mallory Factor, and I'm going to be your guide through the conservative intellectual tradition in America. Our speaker today will be talking about the New Deal. He is an expert on the New Deal. He's written a host of books on the New Deal, including FDR Goes to War, which is brand new, and the New Deal, or Raw Deal. So we will learn a lot from him. He currently holds the Charles Klein Chair in History and Management at Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan. And he's a senior fellow in economic education for the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. He serves also as a senior historian at the Foundation for Economic Education, FEE, and writes a quarterly column for FEE's publication, The Freeman, which we'll learn a little more about as we go a little further along in this course. He's published 7 books, and these books revise the commonly held views about the role of capitalism in the social development of the Industrial Revolution and the Gilded Age. These books also include Urban Capitalists, The Myth of the Robber Barons, as well as how FDR's economic legacy has damaged America and empire builders. He's written for a host of publications, from the Wall Street Journal to Investor's Business Daily. He's appeared on numerous television shows, including Glenn Beck, which he was just on yesterday, and Fox and Friends, and numerous shows on C-SPAN as well. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Burton Folsom, Jr.
Thank you, Mallory. I'm glad to be here talking about President Franklin D. Roosevelt. As you know, president in the 1930s, during the Great Depression. He had a program called the New Deal, a series of programs actually. How many of you, in growing up in classes, heard things about Franklin Roosevelt, the Great Depression, and the New Deal? Any in the audience, of course, many of our students? Well, let me ask our cadets here and expand the question to our audience generally. How many of you, in going through your classes, high school and beyond, generally had professors who were favorable to Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal? Most of the cadets here, quite a few of the guests. Right. It would be the same here. Maybe I'd ask a different question. How many of you had parents who were favorable to Franklin Roosevelt? Fewer, interestingly. But still, in the classroom, the textbooks, all of this, he ranks very high, almost always within the top 3 in presidential polls. The Schlesinger poll, the most common poll, he got a great rating, the highest rating that can be given to any president by every historian who did the poll except for one, and that historian had him as up there, but just not great. So we have a top-ranking president. And the idea, the philosophy here is, in a general sense, you have a depression, we have unemployment, 20%, sometimes 25%, very high, double-digit unemployment. You have, the idea is, if you put people to work. By the way, what are the names, some of the cadets may know, what are the names of some of Roosevelt's programs? Do you remember that were part of the New Deal? Yes, sir.
Works Project Administration?
Yes, Works Projects Administration. It actually had a double name, Works Progress Administration, but at one time it was Works Projects Administration. Yes, sir.
Tennessee Valley Authority?
Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, you have the WPA, right. Those are big ones. And, yes, sir.
Civilian Conservation Corps?
CCC. Anita, my wife, who and co-author, who I am very dependent upon in my work, her father, his first job with the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. Yes. these and other programs, you see the idea. You have unemployment, you put people to work in the CCC, the WPA, you do work with river reclamation and this sort of thing. You do with the TVA, electricity and this kind of thing. And all of a sudden jobs are generated, in the case of the WPA, for people doing the road building or people doing the building of construction projects, hospitals, schools, this kind of thing. Then that puts people to work, they spend money, and you get out of the Great Depression ultimately. In other words, you have spending and then you get recovery. How many heard that formulation in school? Mallory, let me have the first, the New Deal or Raw Deal, this one. Here is what Henry Morgenthau, Secretary of Treasury, Roosevelt's own Secretary of Treasury, said about the New Deal it was 7 years into the New Deal, 1939. He was looking at the unemployment statistics and he saw they were 20.7%. 7 years almost after Roosevelt's elected, unemployment statistics 20.7%. And Morgenthau said this: "We have been spending money. We are spending more than we have ever spent before, and it does not work. And I have just one interest, and if I'm wrong, somebody else can have my job. I want to see this country prosperous. I want to see people get a job. I want to see people get enough to eat. We have never made good on our promises." I say after 8 years of this administration, we have just as much unemployment as when we started, and an enormous debt to boot. That is spoken by one of President Roosevelt's best friends. The man who made that statement had a picture of himself and Roosevelt side by side. Roosevelt signed it and said, "From one of two of a kind." They had lunch together, breakfast together. They would pass notes to each other sometimes at cabinet meetings. That is what that man said about the New Deal. In frustration, after 7 years, it had not worked. And somebody's saying, "Are you saying that when you have high unemployment and you pump money into the economy by the WPA and these various programs, that it doesn't work?" Yes, I'm saying exactly that. Put it in your notes. That's exactly what I'm saying. And I'm going to try to explain it here in 3 parts today, by looking at the 1920s, by looking at the 1930s, and then by looking at the war and the end of the war, to try to illustrate how the spending on recovery, the stimulus package approach, is an optical illusion, as we saw demonstrated in the New Deal. All of that spending, massive record spending on these programs, and we had double-digit unemployment every year after putting those programs into effect for the rest of the 1930s. Let's start with the 1920s. I wanted to start there because it's a good illustration, then go to the 30s. So step 1, the 20s, step 2, the 1930s, and then look a little bit at the 40s as well as we finish the Roosevelt presidency. The 1920s. What we had coming out of World War I was something similar to what we had going into the 1930s, and that is high unemployment. And the reason we had it, World War I had ended, 4 million soldiers are out, coming home from being on the battlefields in Europe. They come home, they can't get a job. We had high taxes in place, and the argument there that President Wilson had was it was to pay for the war. And so we have high taxes, entrepreneurs are not really getting into business very much, and we have 12% unemployment. Right now, current unemployment indicators are 8.3, 8.5% in that vicinity. Now, we're talking here about 12% unemployment. So we have double-digit unemployment in 1921. It becomes the issue in the 1920 campaign. And in the 1920 campaign, can anybody help me who won the election in 1920? Who was president? You're right, Matt. It is Coolidge, vice president. And who's the president? Harding. You know, I find this interesting because they are hard to remember. I mean, I don't hold you people at all in check for this because these are not well-known presidents. Matt got Coolidge, and he was vice president. Warren G. Harding was president. You don't think of those presidents very much, do you? They came in 1920, and the idea was, well, what are you going to do about this unemployment that we've got here? And there were even suggestions. What we need is a gigantic stimulus package. See, and here's the logic. Listen to the logic. The automobile is becoming a universal acquisition for everybody. Just about everybody has an automobile, but the roads aren't very good because formerly we were doing horses and buggies and that kind of thing. You need different surfacing, of course, for cars. And so what you do is you have cars, and we don't have a lot of that surfacing. So why don't we put these soldiers returning home from the war to work building roads? And then we'll put them to work, and they'll plow money into the economy, and we'll get out of this 12% unemployment. Harding said no. Coolidge said no. The argument was interesting. They said, number one, it's unconstitutional. Now that right there is a shocker, isn't it? They were reading the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, and discovered nowhere in the Constitution does it give the federal government the power to put money into place for roads. And there's a reason for that. And James Madison explained that when he gave a veto of a bill in 1817. Madison and Jefferson, those old-style agrarians, said you could obviously then, if you had that power of the federal government for road building, plow it into your home state or states where you wanted votes, and that isn't what we want to do. Why not have the states in charge of the road building? Yes, we want roads, we just don't think the federal government ought to be the place where it's done. And so what we had is state and local road building. Harding said it worked for Jefferson and Madison, it works for me. He also said and believed that it wouldn't work. Because if you build a road and you put people to work, that's nice, but where do you get the money to do it? That's the key question. What you see is the road being built, and you see former soldiers at work building the road. What you don't see is the money that is taken from taxpayers to build the road. And those taxpayers could have spent the money on other things. Maybe actually they would have wanted to build roads too, but the point is it would have been their choice. And that makes an interesting question. Who better spends money? Government bureaucrats or you? And who is more likely to spend money on things that are really items that people would really want? We recognize roads are going to have to be built. It should be done at the state and local level. At the federal level, we keep the government out and limited. We keep taxation limited. People spend their own money. And so people said, well, is this the politics of no? And Harding, oh, no, two programs. Two parts of the program. It's just that it's not a stimulus package approach. Number one, we cut federal spending. Number two, we cut tax rates, income tax rates. Now that's interesting. This is the reverse of the stimulus package. You have high unemployment, so what do? You cut back federal spending and you cut the income tax, and in effect, more people are going to have money to spend as they see fit. And Harding and Coolidge's argument is that will get us out of this Great Depression of 1920 and 1921. The interesting thing about being a historian is we get to look and see what happened. We know what happened. We have let me tell you this. First of all, Harding and Coolidge, true to their word, Harding dies in office, so Coolidge will come in and fulfill his program. They cut federal spending by roughly 50% in the first 2 years of Harding's presidency, from roughly $6 billion a year to $3 billion a year. A 50% cut in federal spending, and they cut the federal income tax, the top rate, from 73%. They cut it down to, this is the top rate, and that's pretty high. I mean, that's 3 out of every $4 at the top level. And they cut that down to 56%, and they were eventually going to get it down to 25%. So what you see, income tax rates going down, federal spending going down, and unemployment's at 12%. The question is, what is unemployment 2 years later? The answer? 2%. Now I want to be technical and use the official figure of the U.S. Bureau of Census, 2.4%. So I rounded down, shame on me. 2.4%, or rounding it to the nearest percent, 2%. Unemployment in 1923, after 12% unemployment in 1921. And what you have, you said, well, what's going on here? What's going on is the beginning of one of the most prosperous decades in U.S. history. What we had is all of a sudden, tax rates are going down, federal spending's going down, and it's clear the direction we're headed. And they say, we're trusting entrepreneurs to make the difference. And what happened was a burst of entrepreneurship. We get to keep the money we make from the projects that we start. That's exciting. The 1920s, radio is invented and used and becomes a standard household item. It just sweeps in somewhat the way an iPhone is doing. Where, right? 6 years ago, hardly anybody has an iPhone, and 4 years from now, practically everybody will have one. Or at least a majority of people. That sweeping through the nation, radio had the same effect in the 1920s. But I'm not done with that. Here's some other changes. Tell me, here's one. Now, some of these are like sliced bread. You hear about the greatest invention since sliced bread? It was invented in the 20s. That's the beginning of the peanut butter and jelly sandwich. The 1920s. We had them before, but now we've got the sliced bread. Scotch tape, 1920s. We told people you could invent a way you get to keep what you make. Now here's one. Do you think in Charleston, South Carolina, this invention would be of perhaps casual interest? Air conditioning. Air conditioning. And it was invented by a Yankee. Wouldn't you know it? Willis Carrier. He was hired by a firm in Brooklyn, which was a printing company. They were having problems with, they would print items and they would pile on one another and they would smear. The paper would smear, and they said, could we invent something to dehumidify the room more quickly? Because if we dehumidify the room more quickly, we won't get the smearing on the paper. And so he began to pull a lot of the humidity out of the room and had devices, and he noticed it had a cooling effect, see? But he puts that aside, well, this is something that I might want to explore, that I could actually cool the room as well as dehumidify it. So he's playing around, but he went with his dehumidifier. And so now he's doing this in the 19-teens, and then we come into the 1920s, Willis Carrier, and he was trying to make some of these air conditioning contraptions. But when you're taxing someone 70%, you're in effect saying, if you succeed, 3/4 of everything you make past a certain point, that's a marginal rate, past a certain point, goes to the government. You get to keep 1/4. Well, he didn't think that was quite enough to make him take the risk. But then, when we begin to get the tax cuts, 1924, he begins to be more industrious with his sales. The first industry, the first group to buy an air conditioner. Now, this is interesting. You think about this. Who would be the first to buy an air conditioner? Any thoughts? The first to kind of product or group that would want that? I mean, Matt?
Movie theater?
Absolutely right. Cadet Salmaska's got it on the button. Movie theater! It used to be in the movie industry that the sales would be up here in the winter and then they drop in the summer because it would be so hot in the theater. The Rivoli Theater in New York City took a chance on Carrier's air conditioning and put it in. And it's kind of funny, they put it in and then all of a sudden they had big attendance and they're sitting there thinking, well, I wonder, it could be that the movie is so good. And they're doing kind of early exit polls. Well, what do you think? They're asking people, what'd you think of the movie today? And you get people saying, what movie? And I'm here for the movie. I'm here to get out of that heat out there. And soon we had, by 1930, 6 years later, 300 movie theaters had air conditioning. Now, these were huge contraptions, multi-ton devices. And so it took a while. Then you get them into factories. Then, 1939, I regret to say, we put them in Congress, which kept them in session longer. So there are some negative unintended consequences of air conditioning. And then, of course, we get home units. I remember our first home unit. I grew up in Nebraska, so that we have not the hottest summers like we do here in South Carolina. But even then, it got hot enough in the summers in 1962. We got our first air conditioner. And so home units began to become popular in the 1960s. So they become profitable. But you see, you have to start with big units. They become profitable. You figure out how to make small units. And by the 1960s, you have a lot of home units. And that starts air conditioning. But listen, the 1920s is full of inventions. I don't want to just stop there. We had talking movies. How many have seen the movie The Artist? Some of you? The audience? Well, that's a talking movie. You see an example of how movies once were, at least get some idea. And we go from movies that are silent movies, I should say, like The Artist, and then we have talking movies. But you get the studios ready to take the risk because you're telling them, if you make some money by giving people something that they want, and that's how you make money, give people something they want, then you get to keep most of the money you make. And when we told them that that was the deal, then we had invention, risk, and we're going to get the beginnings as we move toward modern day movies, modern day movie theater. So you get the air conditioning for the theater, you get the talking movies coming into the theaters. Another invention of the product of the 1920s is kind of interesting because probably everybody in this room is using it. No one was using it in 1920. We're all using it today. It went by the name, it had a Swedish inventor, Swedish American, Gideon Sundback. He called his invention hookless number 2. Hookless number 2. Today we know the invention as the zipper. The zipper. When he took his first hookless number 2 to the patent office, the patent guy was looking at him use that and said, hey, we're liberal in the way we dispense patents. I'm going to give you a patent for that. But I can't imagine a use for it. And so we have hookless number 2 coming into, but of course we aren't going to have it in the early 1920s because in the early 1920s we don't have tax rates that make it suitable for zipper companies to try to start. We get into the mid-1920s, all of a sudden, we get B.F. Goodrich, took a chance on buying a couple 100,000 hookless number 2s to make galoshes for women. They advertised it. They brought in Madison Avenue advertisers from New York, and they had a picture of a woman with her galoshes, or galosh if that's the singular or whatever. They had her up, and they had her with her fingers here, and the caption was, "Zip her up." And hookless number 2 went by the wayside. Zipper came into play, and instead of using buttons to button our clothes, zippers become increasingly popular. And there you have, now what's interesting about this 1920s phenomenon with all these inventions, the reduction of unemployment, the change in life, the growth in national product and prosperity and low unemployment, is that very little of this could we have anticipated. In other words, if you were to have asked Harding, well, what are these people going to invent that's going to make life so much better by the end of the decade? He couldn't have said, we're going to invent air conditioning, right? Or we're going to invent the zipper. So zip your lip. We couldn't have had any of those kinds of conversations because he doesn't know what's going to work and what isn't. If we were to look at this, we find all sorts of contractions. People trying to do the old airplane with the wings. We got all of this stuff that doesn't work, and some does. But in a market economy, we choose those products that we want to buy, and lo and behold, some of them were very good, and the 1920s becomes a decade of incredible inventiveness, and we see remarkable prosperity. And I want to just touch a minute on this because our Southern agrarians, Donald Davidson, Robert Penn Warren, and others, were not happy with this. They wrote their book, I'll Take My Stand, in 1930, after this great decade. And they say, industry is breaking down regionalism. And regionalism is wonderful, and there are parts of it that are. The radio means that you get communication all across the country. It's hard in Charleston to be isolated if you want to be with a radio because you get communication with the outside, exposure to the outside world, air conditioning. To not want industry in progress in the way of industrial progress is to protect your regional culture in many ways, yes. It's also to do without many of the inventions and improvements that make our lives dramatically easier today. It's very easy for Professor Donald Davidson, Professor Davidson at the University at Vanderbilt in Nashville, to say, well, these regional trends are no good. Well, what are you supposed to tell the people in Charleston, South Carolina, don't buy an air conditioner? How many would like to go through July and August here in Charleston with no air conditioning? Yeah. You also had, as another invention of the 20s was or development. It was invented before, but it became popular in the 20s. Like many of these invented before, but then you get the tax rates down and they become prominent in the 20s, is the refrigerator. We used to have an iceman come up and drop a big chunk of ice, and you had what was called an ice box, and you might put your plates and things on the ice in the ice box. But a refrigerator is a whole lot easier. You don't have all that water and all of this, so a refrigerator becomes much more popular in the 1920s. These inventions were wonderful for the South. Anita and I spend part of our time each year in Atlanta, a city of 5 million. I wonder how big Atlanta would be without air conditioning. You get a city of 5 million, the change and the opportunities that they're able to offer people in the South is magnificent. True, the regionalism in the South breaks up, and I know there are complaints the Yankees are coming down and moving in and all of this. It also provides opportunities in the South. And what we see today is the South and the economy of the South gradually, slowly but surely, surpassing the economy of the North. So much so that we're hearing that Alabama's economy is going to pass Michigan's soon. That would have been unthinkable 30 and 40 years ago. Opportunities are there with industry, but it does break down regional barriers. The Southern agrarians valued regional barriers, and Davidson in his essay on the Old South and Charleston, it's too bad when people are motivated solely by money. And I think that that's right, and the Bible tells us that the love of money is the root of all evil. But I'm not sure that if you're inventing an air conditioner and doing that you're necessarily love money. There are lots of things that go into that. You are self-interested, but there's an inventiveness that says, I want to change the world. I want to improve life. I want to help people. And that's part of it as well. And when you invent a product like that, lives are being saved. Lives are being saved. People are not going to have the kind of overheating and heat stroke that's going to take lives and put people in misery and make them unproductive. I can't imagine writing New Deal or Raw Deal in Charleston in the summer without air conditioning. I could never have written this book. It's only when I'm says, oh gee, I got to write and get me a nice cool iced tea or something by, or a soft drink or something. Now I can write. Well, yeah, those are the sorts of things that make it easier for us to do our daily job, and I'm grateful for those people. And I'm sorry that there are some advantages to regional boundaries that are good, but there are also some advantages to economic development and increasing opportunities and prosperity. And that's where I take issue with the Southern agrarians, and I frankly think that Madison and Jefferson, part of those old agrarian types, would have been very pleased to see their economies coming around in Virginia and other parts of the South and taking their place in the world as being industrial leaders. Jefferson, I realize, very agricultural. He wanted an agricultural society. But to see your part of the world pursue economic development in an effective way is also very pleasing. Now, we get into the 1920s, and that takes us to the 1930s. Unfortunately, we had, under Herbert Hoover, a change. Even though Hoover was a Republican and Harding and Coolidge were Republicans, Hoover was from a different wing of the Republican Party. He favored much more intervention. And he had the idea, well, I realize we get unemployment down to 2%, but I think we could use government to help make that even better. We had, and Hoover signed the highest tariff in U.S. history, which in effect said, we're not going to buy watches from Switzerland, and we're going to put a high tariff on them so that we can sell local watches made in Massachusetts and Connecticut. Well, that's fine, except the Swiss don't sit around and say, oh, you know, we're selling watches. Back then, a watch was $2 or $3. He says, American watches, listen, American watches back in the 1920s were not only more expensive. Our watches were more like $4. Swiss watch was maybe $2 to $3. Our watches ran the hour in 58 minutes. In other words, they didn't keep very good time. We had to reset them in the morning. The Swiss watches kept better time, and they're cheaper. So Americans bought the Swiss watches. But American watchmakers lost the business. So we think, oh, let's put a tariff or a tax on imported Swiss watches, and then people will buy American. Well, that's nice, except the people in Switzerland, it's really sad to read about what happened in Switzerland. That's their major industry, watchmaking. They didn't just sit around and say, well, we'll just yodel in the hills to the sounds of music and get off our watchmaking business. On the contrary, they said, we're not buying American. So now American automobiles, which are competitive, American typewriters, now we're back to the air conditioning and all of these other inventions, all of that, no, they boycotted us. So now competitive American car makers are going to be shut off from Switzerland. You might say, well, Switzerland, that isn't that big a country. Well, this kind of thing that I'm using as an example, that happened all over Europe. We wouldn't buy British blankets. We wouldn't buy Spanish olives. And so all of a sudden, all over Europe, we're putting high tariffs on products that they sent to us. They wouldn't buy our materials. Some of this is reflected. For example, auto sales. 1929, great year, roaring 20s. We sold 5 million automobiles. 1933, we sold about 1.5 million automobiles. Now there's more to it than just foreign sales, but that's a part of it. Foreign sales are down. And therein lies the problem. We hurt all of American industry through that kind of intervention. We also had the Federal Reserve raised interest rates, made it harder to borrow money. Milton Friedman won the Nobel Prize, writing a book which described that and how it hurt the American economy. President Hoover raised tax rates. That made it harder for entrepreneurs to make a profit and less willing to take risks. Hoover's administration was a failure, and it's not surprising that Franklin Roosevelt beat him. Franklin Roosevelt ran promising to cut federal spending because he thought Hoover had gone way too far by taking a good economy and weakening that economy tremendously. Roosevelt came into power, though, and he changed his mind, and we can later discuss perhaps some of the motives in changing his mind, but here I want to say this. Roosevelt began pouring federal funds into the American economy, the equivalent of the modern-day stimulus package. Many of you have listed some of the programs that Roosevelt had. One of them, we'll talk about the WPA in a minute, one of these programs was called the AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Administration. And the idea here is farmers have low prices for the products they're making because people can't afford to buy much because unemployment's gotten over 20%. And so the idea was, hey, Roosevelt said, he came up with an idea. It is so wild. It's such a wild idea, it could only have been invented by a college professor. The idea was, let's pay farmers not to produce. I think that's secretly because college professors, we like to think of ourselves being paid not to produce. And sadly, the world would be a better place if we paid many college professors not to produce. But nonetheless, paying not to produce becomes part of the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, under Franklin Roosevelt. Now, the idea, see, you have low prices that the farmers are making, so if you pay them, here's the deal. You'll have them set aside as much as a fourth of their land, 25%, and then you'll pay them not to produce on that 25%. And that will be good because it'll get farm income up because they'll be getting money. And also, it will reduce the overproduction of corn and wheat and cotton and other farm products because the farmer will only be producing on 3/4 of his land because a fourth of it's out of circulation. That sounds wonderful. President Roosevelt discovered a most unpleasant development in Washington, D.C. Some farmers were taking this money not to produce and were sneaking crops on that land anyway. And then trying to make double money, see? Solution. We send inspectors out to everybody's land. They're going to have measuring equipment and they're going to go out and measure everybody's land and make sure if you have, say, a 160-acre farm, that 40 acres and exactly that are not farmed on. And if you do farm on them, we're going to make you dig it all up. Well, President Roosevelt can sit back in his chair and relax. And he heard something, again, most unpleasant news that came into Washington. That news was that some of the farmers were taking the money that they were receiving not to produce and bribing the inspector with some of that money to go to the next field. We have a solution. We send inspectors to inspect the inspectors. Then we had another group of inspectors, as we say, coming in to look at the land, and we found out that some of those inspectors were being bribed as well. With inspectors and inspectors inspecting the inspectors being bribed, the next step was to get a fleet of airplanes and go over everybody's land and take pictures of it. That way we can see if anybody's cheating or not. All of this for a farm program, and by the way, the Department of Agriculture became the second largest department in the federal government next to the Defense, then the Department of War. Because of all of these employees who are going around the country inspecting farms and flying airplanes and taking pictures of all of this. Lo and we discover in 1934 that some of the farmers had taken the money that they got from being paid not to produce and they used it to buy fertilizer for the other 3/4 and they had great production on the three-fourths, and some crops were actually up in production in 1934, ahead of what they were in 1933 and 32. Thus, the farm crisis persists. I say that because it gives you an idea how you have a program, you intend good things, and there are unintended consequences of the program. It kind of backfires, and it becomes very expensive. Who's going to be paying for all these inspectors and airplanes and photography and all of that? Cadet Faust?
Taxpayers.
The taxpayer. Taxes are going to go up to a top rate under Roosevelt of 79% in the 1930s. 79% is the top marginal rate. So now we're going to be telling our super entrepreneurs that they have to give 4 out of every $5 to the U.S. government. We discovered that very few people are inventing things. If you look at inventions and patents, we find very few in the 1930s, just as we found a lot in the 1920s, very little in the 1930s. One of the ones I like to laugh at is the board game Monopoly was one of the inventions of the 30s. You know, you're broke, so go past go and get $200 and that kind of thing. It excites people, and that's one of the inventions of the 1930s. But we don't find these inventions that create jobs like air conditioning and even zipper making or refrigerator making and this kind of thing. We don't find that outflow of creativity because people are reluctant to take risks when, in fact, they have to pay most of what they earn to the government if they're successful. Thus, we are in a deepening Great Depression. It persists throughout Roosevelt's first 2 terms. I want to talk about the WPA because, see, the question that often gets asked, well, wait a minute here. If this was so bad, how can this guy keep getting reelected? I mean, that's a very good question. Mallory, can I borrow the other book for a minute? In FDR Goes to War, thank you. I want to read, see if you can get that. This is the WPA, road building. Road building. See if you can get a clue how Roosevelt is being reelected. I thought it best just to quote some of these people and try to explain it by what they were going through, people who went through at the times, the 1930s, and were part of this whole process of elections and federal programs. V.G. Copeland was the Democratic Party county chairman in Indiana, the state of Indiana. And he says this. He's talking about the WPA. What I think will help is to change the WPA management from top to bottom. Put men in there who are in favor of using these democratic projects to make votes for the Democratic Party. In other words, we target WPA projects. Everybody has roads they want built. The question is, what states and what districts are going to get those roads? And the answer is those who please President Roosevelt, or those who are in swing states that President Roosevelt wants to carry. For example, the Democrats had not carried Pennsylvania, the state of Pennsylvania, in decades. Pennsylvania was targeted with a heavy amount of WPA spending. Bring those projects into the WPA. And what we found is David Lawrence, who was a magazine editor, a newspaper writer, did a survey of Pennsylvania, and he found that those counties in Pennsylvania that received no federal funds or limited federal funds in 1936 voted Republican. The more money you received, the more likely your county was to vote Democrat. And Roosevelt made sure that a lot of money went into Pennsylvania's big cities, Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, to go Democratic. Let me read some other quotations. This might help. This is a congressman, Frank Towie from New Jersey, and he said this. He's giving a speech, and here's what he says about the WPA. Congressman from New Jersey. In this county, there are 18,000 people on the WPA. With an average of 3 in a family, you have 54,000 potential Democratic votes. Can anyone beat that if it is properly mobilized? Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? We have, for example, as we go into the 1940 election, where Roosevelt runs for a third term, the WPA is very strong. James Doherty, a New Hampshire Democrat, says this: "It is my personal belief that to the victor belong the spoils, and that Democrats should be holding most of those WPA positions so that we might strengthen our fences for the 1940 elections." And I'll just conclude this by a Southern senator. As you know, Southern senators were often part of the Democratic Party. We had the solid Democratic South. Carter Glass, one of Virginia's senior senator, said this. He was honest. He was talking about the overwhelming re-election of Franklin Roosevelt in 1936 with high unemployment in the United States. And he said this: "The 1936 elections would have been much closer had my party not had a $4.8 billion WPA relief bill as campaign fodder." Right? He saw it happen. I mean, they all saw it. They saw the money going out at election time. Sometimes people working in federal organizations were distributing campaign literature in October of 36. And he saw that overwhelming amount of federal aid going into the election and producing victories for the Democratic Party. What we had then is the Democratic Party able to win elections even though the policies were not getting us out of the Great Depression. And this is where we have that paradox that the policies are failing, but the president is able to continually win re-election. This is a huge change in American history. I wish the Southern agrarians would have written more on this, which apparently they did not quite see as threatening as the rise of industry. Interesting. Now, some of them did oppose this. I'm not suggesting that Robert Penn Warren was a huge fan of Roosevelt, but by writing a big novel against Huey Long, he was writing against Roosevelt's main opponent in the Democratic Party in his book, All the King's Men. And so I'm suggesting these people, the Southern agrarians, were not really as opposed to what was going on in the federal government, oddly enough, as they were with the industrial development, how that radio and air conditioning and that sort of thing, how that broke down barriers in the South. What we have is Franklin Roosevelt winning elections, but it's at a big cost because the taxes are going to have to go up. When we get into World War II, they really go up. We have in World War II, Roosevelt does not spend much to get us ready for the war effort. And we're not really ready at all. And when the Pearl Harbor attack comes, it takes the United States a long time to get ready. And Roosevelt's got to figure out, how do I get entrepreneurs to produce military equipment with these high tax rates? He has to make arrangements to help the entrepreneurs do something with the tax rates, at least temporarily during war, so that we can get entrepreneurs producing again. And I'm happy to say they did. We had incredible developments. Penicillin. Some of this was help from Great Britain too. Radar. These kinds of things. Landing craft. Well, we have to give the Navy credit for something, don't we? Landing craft. The Navy, and this was interesting because we see an entrepreneurial flavor to this. The Navy had its own landing craft, and this is very important because when you're going to land that great army at Normandy and other places, right, to defeat Hitler, you have to have them land and not get picked off by the Germans. You can't have them land in major ports because those are the easiest for the Germans to get. The beauty of good landing craft is you can land in kind of rocky places and get ashore, and the Germans don't know where you're going to land. When we have Andrew Higgins invented landing craft that could bring 40 soldiers into shore, and the landing craft would stop short of the shore. They'd have to get out and then in water come to shore. But the point is, they could land almost anywhere instead of being limited to the ports. That landing craft that Andrew Higgins had, the Navy at first opposed. And then finally, the man who's going to become vice president, Harry Truman, was head a committee that we're going to look at various military inventions, find out which ones work best, and adopt those. So it's not just going to be These guys have power and they're going to impose their landing craft on the nation. You have to prove your landing craft is best before we'll use it. And the Navy, the landing craft that was developed by the Navy had to go up against Higgins' landing craft. And Higgins, you have to give the guy credit, he said, okay, I'm going head to head against the Navy, and by the way, I'm going to have a boat on side because after I land my landing craft in and drop all my, they were doing it, they each had a tank, they didn't have soldiers, they were each going to do a tank and bring a tank from one point to another. He says, after I get my tank in, I want to have another boat there to catch the navies because they'll probably turn over. And that's exactly what happened. The navies turned over and his came into shore just fine. And Truman was outraged. He says, Navy, you need to be buying Higgins' landing craft. Dwight Eisenhower said, there is the man who won the war for us. He was that strong. And I'm happy to say even in the Army, we had, and I have to give Roosevelt credit for this, he allowed General Marshall, Chief of Staff, to make decisions. He did, the typical Roosevelt way would have been, oh, I want to carry Pennsylvania. Let's have this general from Pennsylvania conduct this battle. And so we go into Sicily with some general who has no experience. Instead he says, no, I want to bring Patton in there. Right? Or he says, I want to have Eisenhower conduct the Normandy operation. And of course he gets the right people in there. Roosevelt, I have to give him credit, stood aside and allowed General Marshall to look over hundreds of generals to bring in Eisenhower, who has just barely become a general. And he was in his 50 years old and looked like someone who was just going to be a lifer, who was an officer but didn't have a particularly spectacular career, brought him in there to command the troops. We did get good people in good positions, and we won that war. Roosevelt was interested in raising the tax rate and did so, however, to 94%. 94% on all income over $200,000. Every dollar you earned over $200,000, you paid 94 cents of that dollar to the government and you kept 6 cents. When 1945 came and the bombs were dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Roosevelt had died by then, but his successors wanted to continue his programs. Roosevelt wanted programs to have massive continuation of federal intervention. Congress looked at that and said, our people fought this war, our cadets, civilians who became soldiers, the 12 million and more who went overseas. They fought that war for freedom. They didn't fight that war so that 94% of everybody's earnings could be taken away. That's other people. That's not the United States. That's other people do that. That isn't what we do in this country. It's as though the honor, duty, and respect is so much part of the American culture that we want to fight that war to preserve it, even against fierce enemies on their home ground over in Europe. Yes, we give them the tools. We give them the tools. We give them, B-17s, we go to the B-24s, we begin to improve our tanks. We produce the ammunition and we do it. But we had people willing to go over there because they said, this country stands for something, it's worth it. That type of commitment, I think, helped a little bit with Congress after the war saying, what direction do we want to go? And this is my final point. What direction are we going to go? Are we going to go with the big spending end of Franklin Roosevelt and have a new batch of federal programs? And he wanted them. He wanted a federal housing authority. He said his argument was everybody has a right to, quote, a decent home. Which is interesting because if Cadet Bell has a right to a decent home, then Cadet Ford has an obligation to pay for Cadet Bell with his decent home. That's very different from freedom of speech, isn't it? Now, you people, unfortunately, are locked in. You have to hear me. But those people out there could walk out in our audience anytime. Freedom of speech does not impose obligations of others even to sit around and listen, least of all to pay for it. Freedom of religion does not mean you have to pay for anybody's church. But if Cadet Bell has a right to a decent home, then all of us have an obligation to finance that home. And by the way, what is a decent home? Well, I mean, of course, air conditioning, if you're in Charleston, but we didn't have home air conditioning much in 1940s. So you can see the bureaucrats are going to be changing the definition all the time. It's going to be an incredible boondoggle. That is the direction that Franklin Roosevelt wanted to head. And they said, if you don't have government jobs to build people these homes and have more types of WPA projects, we're going to go huge into unemployment. Sidney Hillman, who was head of the CIO, you know, the old AFL-CIO, back then the CIO was separate. Sidney Hillman, head of the CIO, said, if you don't have a lot of programs and have them quick, the soldiers are going to come home and you're going to have 10 million unemployed in 6 to 10 weeks. Senator Harley Kilgore of West Virginia said, no, it's going to be 18 million. We're going to have unemployment worse than the Great Depression. 12 million soldiers are going to come home and there's nothing for them. Congress, led by Senator Walter George of Georgia, Democrat, Senator Albert Hawks of New Jersey, a Republican, led the charge to cut federal taxation, cut federal spending, and they even cited what Coolidge, Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of Treasury, and Harding and others did in the 1920s. George said, I was senator back in the 20s. I saw what happened. Let's go that route. We cut federal spending by 2/3 after the war. We cut the corporate income tax from 90% to 38%. We cut the income tax. We told people, you're going to get to keep more of what you produce. We're going to trust Americans with the freedom they went overseas to fight and earn, with the results, and take our chances. Rather than empowering government bureaucrats and czars with power to allocate federal funds taken from taxpayers, we're going to cut the tax rates and turn people loose. Unemployment in 1946 and 1947, the 2 years after the war, it was the same in both years. 3.9%. We assimilated 12 million people back in with an incredible expansion by American entrepreneurs. Many of these inventions we take for granted today and developments. I mean, television had been invented before the war, but it became increasingly popular after the war. Xerox machines, copy machines, fast food, McDonald's, Holiday Inns. A slew of inventions are going to come forth, rivaling the 1920s. Plus, we get a lot of those inventions we had in the 1920s, like air conditioning. We're going to have expansion of those. Automobiles, all of that coming forth. We bring 12 million soldiers home and we get jobs for all of them because of the expansionist economy with entrepreneurs who are willing to take risks and willing to take chances. That is what ended the Great Depression. Giving people more freedom, not empowering government bureaucrats. That is the story of overcoming the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt. Thank you.
Okay, we're back with Dr. Burt Folsom Jr. and his co-author of this fabulous book, FBR Goes to War, Anita Folsom. So, questions. Let's start off with some questions. Yes, sir, Mr. Ford.
Sir, what's the difference between the New Deal organizations like the TVA and the WPA and the contemporary government contractors? Are we maintaining this progressive movement with the veil of private organization or private business like Blackwater, or even like Aramark, that every college in America has the same food contractor, and the military is in the same boat?
There's some real parallels with today. So you may have seen, in other words, with WPA, of course, we had the federal government giving money to different congressional districts and that sort of thing to build roads. A lot of the stimulus package was that way. It was allocated to different areas for local projects, sometimes to build football fields in places in Mississippi and this kind of thing. One was to build a big lighting equipment in Montana and all of this. So you get a lot of that parsed out to different groups, hoping, of course, to receive benefits. Where it gets into the really bad cases, of course, when it gets into Solyndra, because there you get the idea that we need to have solar panels, and instead of letting the market help us to determine what sources of energy we ought to move toward in the future, we're going to give incentives for solar energy, and Solyndra never was able to produce solar panels cheaply. And so they receive a huge amount of government money, as you know, over $500 million, but they're giving a lot of it to the Democratic Party. So the parallel there of the idea of you give out lots of federal benefits, and then they give some of it back to you for your campaign, was what Roosevelt really was able to use to get continuously reelected, to have those 4 different elections. We see others watching that with great interest and using many of the same tactics today.
Next question. Mr. Mellon, Cadet Mellon.
The New Deal really put huge new powers into the hands of the federal government. To what extent are people conditioned to the idea of receiving benefits from the federal government today? And how can you expect to win in a state like Florida running on a campaign of cutting 2/3 of the federal spending?
I don't know if you want to. Do you want me to take that, or, or any aspect of that?
I'll start it, and then
Anita, by the way, is a full. I could never have written this book without her. She wrote half the chapters, and I'm embarrassed to say in front of this group, she knows more about military history than I do. But it's absolutely true. Go ahead.
yeah, I'm a little odd in being female and being so interested in military history. Perhaps I should have gone to the Citadel, but of course, back when I was in college, girls weren't here. So there you are. It is interesting to watch what FDR was able to set up, because he really took the idea of government intruding, what we would call intruding in people's lives, and making it commonplace. And he used the emergency of the Great Depression to do that. Now, yes, I think we would say that he was the one at least who introduced that idea. And I know my father, even though my father, as Bert said, was in the Civilian Conservation Corps, he still grew up in the 30s with an idea of being personally responsible, being self-reliant, taking care of one's family, always helping a friend, but having that independence. And I am concerned that a lot of that has eroded now that we've had 7 decades of really the New Deal. 70 years ago, Franklin Roosevelt was running for president. That's who was running, Franklin Roosevelt. And so that has hurt. Now, I think what we have to do, and what people are responding to, you see the popularity of campaigns such as Herman Cain's. We live in Atlanta. He has a huge following. And that he believes, again, in self-reliance and in getting government out, but it's going to take educating people. And the other thing, one advantage we have, I think, now is that people your age, you realize that you're investing in a system, in Social Security and some of these other government programs, that is not sound actuarially, so I don't know how much you're going to get out of it. I don't know how much I'm going to get out of it, actually.
It's a very good question, Spencer. If there were an easy answer to that question, our whole last 70 years would be different. People who oppose this spending have been struggling trying to answer that question for 70 years. In other words, you say, how do you carry Florida on a platform of cut 2/3 of the spending, right? I mean, they have Cape Canaveral, they've got old people on Social Security, you have all sorts of things. That's a very good question. And that's why it's such a good question. That's why the founders limited so strongly the areas that the federal government could get involved in because they anticipated from their study of history that elected officials would try to buy voters, and if they did that, it would be hard to stop it. It would be hard to preserve the republic. Franklin Roosevelt is the transitional figure in moving in that direction, which makes your question doubly difficult to answer, except to say, we had under Roosevelt, remember I said 94%? We got that down in the 1980s to 28% top income tax. We began to have some movement because you showed that people will invest more. In other words, the truth and the evidence and the preservation of freedom is such that you can go out and win voters sometimes when it's not even in their best interest. Their best interest is to get a subsidy, and you're saying the freedom of this country, your ancestors, and all of this is on the line, and we've got to go in the other direction. And if we do, people will invent things as they did in the 20s, like air conditioning and zippers and refrigerators, and your life's going to be better, and you can be part of that economic growth. It's not an easy sell. That's part of it.
We talked a lot today about unemployment rates. Anybody know what the unemployment rate is here? That's what I'm asking.
8.3.
Well, see, that's the interesting thing. There are multiple unemployment rates. If you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you will see U1, U2, U3, U4, U5, and U6. There are all different measurements of unemployment. We're only talking about one. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to take a look at that. I'd like you to take a look at what the differences are. Because we talk a lot about unemployment. What is unemployment? Is it the number of people on unemployment compensation? Is it the number of people who would like to work? Is it the number of people who can't find a job, that are looking for a job? It is not that simple. We throw those numbers around quite readily, but it is not that simple and is not that simplistic. I just wanted to point that out. Next question, please. Yes, Cadet King.
Sir, does our public education gear us to believe that the federal government is the solution to all our problems? Because when my generation grew up in high school, our high school football coaches teaching us the curriculum, we all learned that FDR's New Deal got us out of the Depression, and we were in the Depression because of the evils of capitalism and not due to government regulation. Now in classes like this, we'll learn that, these are all pretty much lies that they're telling us. And that was this furthered by certain acts like the No Child Left Behind, curriculums that they're enforcing or trying to get passed to maybe possibly make us mediocre citizens and blindly accept everything that they tell us.
If I may just jump in, No Child Left Behind initially started out in the Bush administration as a voucher program. It just got morphed as it wound its way through Congress, but that's not how it started out. I'm sorry. I'll throw.
No, that's good. That's such a good question because if you think about it, it actually is in the interests of some of the political elites to have a fairly ignorant population. If you believe, hey, this guy's giving me a subsidy or giving me medical care, so I ought to vote for him, and you're not looking at the Constitution, what freedom means, cadets and people here have had to fight for that freedom for generations. Their lives that are lost trying to preserve what we had, and they're not trying to preserve, as I said, that 94% income tax. They're trying to preserve freedom. And it's valuable, but sometimes it's intangible and you take it for granted. And if you can get politicians that say, vote for me because I promise you free medical care, vote for me because I promise you free education, vote for me because I promise you, quote, a decent home, which was Roosevelt's tactic. And you're not thinking about the rich history of this country and what it means to live, to be one of the very few people to live in a society that we are blessed to live in. And instead think about what can I get in my short-term interest and not know this. It is to the advantage of some political elites that take place. I don't know how much of this is they're conspiring or they want to do it, but I'll just put it this way. It's in their best interest to have a lot of people not look deeply into the subsidies that are being offered to them in return for their vote.
Next question. That's how I'm asking.
talking about politicians benefiting from an ignorant public, I just read an article of DNC volunteers trying to register Occupy Wall Street folks to vote, but that's beside the point. Would you say that I guess the idea of the New Deal perhaps maybe spawned with President Wilson, where he was perhaps the first president to openly criticize the Constitution as it's an impediment to progress, it's an impediment to the welfare state. And I was just wondering if you wanted to comment on that.
Sure, go ahead. Anita, would you like to start with that?
I'll start it. Yes, Woodrow Wilson was certainly the first, I think, person who launched down that road. And there's a very good book by Jonah Goldberg called Liberal Fascism. And he goes into all the connections between fascism and the early thinking of Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was a proponent of eugenics, and when Hitler comes into power, he points back to that. Woodrow Wilson and other American leaders favored forced sterilization of certain people. So you get into a lot of those ideas, and certainly the New Deal model. Woodrow Wilson would have loved to have been able to enact more of that sort of thing. And of course, one thing Woodrow Wilson could not enact was pulling the United States into the League of Nations. That was one of the issues that probably led to his stroke when he was president. But Franklin Roosevelt has the Great Depression. That's his emergency. And Franklin Roosevelt was a communicator, we believe, like no one else. And he would go on these fireside chats and make things sound so plausible and so believable. And then we head down the road of all this government intervention. And then, of course, the crisis in Europe begins to loom in 1937, 1938, 1939. We get into the war. And one of the points that we make in FDR Goes to War is that the New Dealers particularly saw World War II as an opportunity to take the New Deal to the world. FDR, we believe one of his goals, he wanted to be the head of the UN. But of course he died before all that came about. But there's a lot of work during the war, just like Woodrow Wilson had something called the Committee on Public Information. Mm-hmm. And they tried to sway public opinion. He had the 4-minute men that would give speeches, pro-war and pro-president speeches all through the American public. Well, in World War II, the United States has the Office of War Information. And Franklin Roosevelt set that up very early, 1942, as soon as we got in the war. In the Office of War Information, now that sounds so straightforward, doesn't it? It just sounds like all they'll do is give you war information. But what they do is they hype the New Deal and the benefits of the New Deal and the benefits of the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt. And then what people begin to notice is huge sums of money are flowing through the Office of War Information and going out to certain groups, certain people, certain countries. At one point, there's a congressional investigation, 1943. 1943, of course, we've got Marines fighting in the Pacific. We've got the American Air Force, Army Air Force, bombing Europe. We've got all these men fighting all around the world. And what is the Office of War Information doing? They've printed up millions of pamphlets in the languages of the countries of South America, and they're getting ready to ship these millions of pamphlets about the New Deal to South America. And this one congressman calls them on the carpet and says, and says to the head of the OWI, gets him in front of a congressional committee, and says, "Sir, how much shipping is this going to displace?" Because shipping in 1943 is a very big issue. No, this is a long answer to your question, but this official says only 800 tons. So they're going to spend 800 tons of shipping in a year when there's not enough shipping for our troops to send propaganda leaflets to South America. Well, the Congress has to cut the funding for all that, but that is the road, and yes, it started with Woodrow Wilson.
Right, I was just making kind of a list of the things you say it starts with Wilson. The income tax, the 16th Amendment with federal income taxes passed in 1913. Wilson takes office in 1913. The Federal Reserve comes in 1913. And so you have a lot of institutions that are important in the Federal Reserve for setting monetary policy. The income tax is fiscal policy. Very, very important in our country, set up under Wilson. And Wilson promoted a progressive tax. So the more you make, the greater your percentage is. And it started, I don't know if anybody knows what the top rate was initially on the first income tax. The most anybody could be taxed. 7%. That's the top. But you see a basic principle set up, the entering wedge, a precedent. And within 30 years after that, it's at 94%. Right? It was at 7% in 1913. It was in the 20% in 1920s. It went up to 63% before Roosevelt came in. It went up to 79% during the New Deal, and it goes up to 94%. Do you see how, well, the rich can always pay more, and pretty soon individual freedom is gone, because if you can do that to rich people, you can do it to other people. You can do it to blacks. You can do it to different groups. Once you establish the principle, you can deprive people of their natural right to property. Then you can move in other directions as well. That starts under Wilson. Minimum wage for railroad work concept for railroad workers starts under Wilson. The federal aid to building roads under Woodrow Wilson. So a lot of programs here that we know today start with Woodrow Wilson. Good question.
I have a question for you all. Anybody have any idea who started the Progressive Party in America? Yes, Mr. Ford.
The churches in that Applied Christianity paper that we wrote, or that we read, there was a big movement for the social, it was like social.
Well, I'm talking about the actual person who founded it. Mr. Lacey?
Is it Teddy Roosevelt?
It sure is. Which is kind of interesting when you think about that. But your comment about churches, the churches were very for the progressive movement until the 60s and 70s, when there became a major transition. And that major transition we'll talk about when Phyllis Schlafly is here, who was part of helping make that transition happen. And she was a major force in that transition happening. But that was very interesting. Yes, the religious community was for creating that leviathan of government, which later they turn against when it starts actually hampering their freedom. Next question, please. Yes, Mr. Lacey.
I thought it was interesting, the link between the decreased taxes and innovation in America, because innovation is great. But at the same time, I think of situations where I feel like a project wouldn't have happened if not for the government, like NASA's things in the 60s and such. And so, do you think there is a role government has to play in innovation, in funding research grants or things like that, or do you think it should be solely left to the market?
Yes, I do. But you raise a good point, because you say, well, look, there's an innovation, and this happened because of government. What's interesting, though, is what innovations is the government going to choose to sponsor? I mean, for example, for a while, Roosevelt wanted to give federal funding to somebody to figure out how to get bats to go over to Japan and wreak havoc with the population. In other words, your assumption is, hey, we've got this good thing, and federal funding could come in without looking at all the bad things that are likely to be funded, and the good thing may not get the funding once you get the bureaucrats, because the bureaucrats then are making decisions on who gets the funding. One quick example on this is with the transcontinental railroads. Good idea, yeah, and we get the first federal, but we do it federally. Union Pacific, Central Pacific, first federally funded transcontinentals. They link up from Omaha, Mr. Ford's country out there, to California, Sacramento. And so what happens is that though is federally funded. Well, it's federally funded, and so what happens is that the people who build the road build it terribly, because they get paid by the mile. So it's terrible track they were using. And they wouldn't even connect the track for a while. I mean, the two railroads couldn't even connect. They had to sit there and have a special congressional law to get them to connect. Because they're being paid by the mile, the Central Pacific was blowing up the Union Pacific's track, and vice versa, because they were each getting paid by the mile to do that. And then, oh, you're being paid by the mile? Watch it go through Nebraska. We're being paid by the mile, right? More miles. So then you get it goes bankrupt and is in receivership. Good idea, federally funded, created disincentives. James J. Hill, the Great Northern Railroad, a Canadian immigrant, a one-eyed Canadian immigrant, comes out and builds a non-federally funded railroad, transcontinental, from St. Paul to Seattle. And that St. Paul to Seattle road is so much superior to the others. And he does it with no federal money. So he took a good idea, but it was 20 years later. What I'm suggesting is assuming you can find the right thing to fund, you fund it, then there are all these unintended consequences, and it's doing damage. 20 years later, you get a delay, somebody privately comes along and does it. To answer your question, it is possible if you get the right person to get the right industry, the right person in the industry, and then get the funding going right.
And one unusual example, I know you're talking about big projects, because many times the big projects seem too big for private industry to do. And one aspect of funding of a big project in the wartime emergency, and we discussed this in FDR Goes to War at some length, is the Manhattan Project. And I'm not saying there wasn't waste in it, I'm sure there was. But we were very fortunate in a country at war that Leslie Groves, I think, was chosen to be the head of that project because I believe he was an honest man. He was very difficult to work for. No one who worked under him liked him. And actually, if you read their diaries, they're just full of expletives every time his name comes up. But he seemed to be he was extremely capable and such a worker, and he kept things simple. Leslie Groves and his secretary, Mrs. O'Leary, she was his only staff member the whole first year. He did everything through her and out of the office. Now, they were setting up these huge operations around the country, but even 1945, he's the head of the Manhattan Project, a $2 billion operation in World War II. He has a 7-room office in the Pentagon, and that's it. He said, I will not work with large staffs. They just make everything difficult. You keep your staff small and you keep it streamlined. So there are some unusual examples, but in private industry, there are a lot of disasters when government starts picking winners and losers.
I'd like to, I'm going to grossly oversimplify, but so please correct me. But I'd like to talk a little bit about the progressive ideology and really what it is in very grossly simplistic terms. It's progressive taxation. It's a living and minimum wage. It's GNP growth. It's universal health care, and it was universal suffrage. But it was also the military-industrial complex, the building of it. It was also economic concentration, and it was also political centralization. And from those latter parts, as well as some of the former ones, you had this Jeffersonian agrarian movement that started to assemble because they knew that the emergence of this revitalized Leviathan would be bad ultimately. And they saw widespread property ownership was being minimized by widespread wage dependency. And they also felt that there was something, and we've used this before in future, like there was something in their DNA that we talked about from starting with Aristotle going into Burke, that of self-sufficiency, of wanting to have small groups, the family and friends as the central group. And we see this breaking down with progressivism, paving the way for state socialism, which we can probably agree has happened to a very significant extent. So anyway, I just wanted to make that point, because those are some, and I'm being grossly simplistic, and I'm not doing justice to our lecturer and to his co-author, but that's just a quick handle on really what's happened, the way I see it. And the real problem, the fundamental problem that I see, the symptoms are living in minimum wage and all but the fundamental problem is the concentration of political and economic power. That is the fundamental problem. It's taking away the regional culture, regional identity, the community focus. which had been built into our, and it's not literally our DNA, but it built into our DNA. And one of my fears is that that DNA, which started with the Magna Carta into the Glorious Revolution, that DNA is starting to change, and it will change. And that's why when we go to other countries and we say we want to give you a democratic way of life, when we go, we talked about the Arab Spring before. The Arab Spring is a great idea, but their DNA is colonialism. It isn't democracy. We may have the best idea for them, but that's not built into their traditions, their way of life, their culture over centuries. So it's very hard to adapt. Please feel free to.
No, that's good.
I think that you point out many of the complexities of progressivism. And I can remember being in graduate school and having seminar classes like this, and we're studying progressivism, and you struggle trying to get a handle on it. Well, what is it? And it's a multitude, as Mallory was reading, it's a multitude of different movements and feelings and thoughts. And let's be clear here, much of it is about intentions. But to us, to Bert and me, yes, you look at intentions, and intentions are very important, but you have to look at results. And that is our big bone to pick with a lot of people who think like progressives. They don't look at results. Now, I'll give you an example of how complex progressivism is. Mallory mentioned suffrage, and that's a very complex history component within American history. And you have, for instance, you have Woodrow Wilson, you have Franklin Roosevelt, both grappling with both women's issues and race issues in their presidencies. And Woodrow Wilson, not as much progress made during that point. Of course, women finally began voting in 1920. But even by the time of Franklin Roosevelt faces many problems with racial issues when he's president, and he won't do much about it. And what Mallory is saying is it's economic and it's political, and the problem was that I feel the African American vote in the United States was seen as too much a solid Democratic vote back then. And we discussed that some in our book. In 1939, they know war is coming. 1940, we have a Selective Service Act. When was the first peaceful draft of American men? And it was in 1940 to get ready for war. Well, both white men and black men were drafted. And 3 black leaders, the head of the NAACP, along with 2 other men, went to the White House to meet with Franklin Roosevelt and his aides and begged him or pleaded with him, gave him a strong statement to desegregate the Army and to give black men in the Army more rights. And Roosevelt said, oh, I'm all for that, but I can't do it right now. He also wouldn't sign an anti-lynching law as president. He wouldn't support one.
No.
All through his presidency, he would not support anti-lynching measures, and they came up constantly in Congress. And he's a progressive. Well, you can see there's a very mixed bag there. And in fact, after this meeting in 1940 between these the leaders of the NAACP and Roosevelt comes out with a statement that the White House is not going to back desegregation of the military, and that he just met with T. Randolph White and these other men, and they're fine with it. Well, what do you think they thought? They immediately protested to the White House, and he wanted them to come back and have another meeting, and I don't blame them. They refused. They said, we're not setting foot in the White House again until you retract that statement. But he's a progressive, so it's a very complex issue of the time.
Next question. Yes, Mr. Cadet Slater.
Well, earlier you were talking about how key that spirit of entrepreneurship and inventing is to reinforcing a policy of cutting spending and tax rates. Now, since the 20s, though, we've seen that loss of that rugged individual spirit, and we've also seen a rise in the number of students attending college. So, if we were able to change policies to one of cutting taxes and spending, do you think that we would have a corresponding rise in entrepreneurial spirit?
Yes, I do. And it's interesting that with education, that becomes part of federal expansion right after World War II. The GI Bill, interestingly, is really the first big federal intervention. But you have to look at Roosevelt's motives. What he wants you to look at is, I want to see soldiers who fought so hard for our country to get an education. The Republicans cut the WPA from the books during the war. There's no more WPA. So Roosevelt in the 1944 election, when he wants to run for a fourth term, is looking around for, how do I get another WPA type of organization? Soldiers, right? So they're getting propaganda, as Anita mentioned, with the Office of War Information, and then you give them free education. See, you're going to have an opportunity for free education. It sounds wonderful, but for example, Anita's father served in World War II. Mine did too, both of our fathers. My father used the GI Bill to get through college. Anita's father did not. In
But
fact,
he
didn't
used,
even-
he used the GI Bill to get through vocational school and become an electrician.
Okay. Some people are going to use the GI Bill to get something, and some people are not in a position to use it. You know, you could do this if you think soldiers are underpaid. You could do something to give them all similar amounts or by ranks. But if you give the free education and hold that out there, that's a way you can reach all of them. And of course, then the colleges become accomplices because they like what you're doing. So you begin to get the college students and college professors tied in with the Democratic Party.
You also, John Dewey reshapes the American polity through an educational model that breaks with the ties of tradition that we talked about. It becomes guided not by the pursuit of truth, but by the impulse to be useful in advancing the progressive ideas and the progressive conditions. So education is also shifting dramatically too, not just in terms of the economics of it,
Right.
but in terms of the actual foundation of it. Mr. Faust, Cadet Faust.
Well, my question was seemed kind of simple. It was just something a lot of us were talking about. It just seems so simple. I mean, you have several instances where you look back in history, and you scale back taxes, you scale back government, entrepreneurship goes up, and unemployment goes down. I mean, if we have so many instances where we see this happening, and we see so many bailout things such as the bailouts or government expansion, and it's not working, why aren't people just jumping on it? I mean, it just seems like it would be so simple. I mean, we're just all a little confused about this. Why aren't we just doing this?
That's the best question of all.
Well, it's one of the reasons I spent so much time looking at the historians and what they say in New Deal or Raw Deal, is that I'm fascinated. You look at the textbooks, and a lot of it isn't what happened in history so much as it's what people say happened in history and what is remembered and what's forgotten. And I'm fascinated. We go here, what is remembered and what is forgotten? What's forgotten, a lot of it, is that the Union Pacific had all that federal aid and went broke. And what's forgotten is the Great Northern had no aid and was successful. How many have heard of an airplane guy inventor named Samuel Langley? Heard of maybe Langley Air Force Base? He received a federal subsidy to build an airplane in 1900. And he had this theory that's kind of, that you boom, the plane up. Like he had like a catapult device. Shoot it, and then get the motors running when you're in the air and it'll go. And we gave federal funding for that. And the first one crashed, and he said, problem, I need more money. So he gave him more money, and the second one crashed, and he said, I need more money. 8 days later, the Wright brothers, with $2,000 of their own money, fly the first airplane. And then he denied that they did, and there were efforts to get more funding, that the Wright brothers had hooked it up. And but see, that's a history lesson that I had to discover 20 years after I had my doctorate, to read into that. That story never made it into the history books. And if stuff isn't making it into the history books, and and I'm not even saying, you say, well, is this a conspiracy? I think it's people historians have a predilection to believe it's a good thing to get government involved, just as I think the opposite. But they think it's a good thing. Getting governments involved, it's good, it helps people, and rich people can afford to pay more, and so let's do it. So when they bring that prism through the facts, they miss stuff that I think they probably wish they'd see. And they see things that that don't really happen. So what they come out is, World War II, we spent a lot of money, and that must have gotten us out of the Great Depression, and so that's the lesson, that's the takeaway. We finally spent a lot of money, we got out, and that's the takeaway point. And they're not, and it's invisible, all those tax cuts that happened afterwards, or that they were predicting there'd be 18 million unemployed, or go back to World War I where we didn't make the cuts right away and we had 12% unemployed, and then we come in and cut it. Those facts never quite make it into the history book. I don't think when I was, none of those I was taught, by the way. And I don't think they were saying, Folsom's around. Let's be quiet when we talk about the tax cuts. He'll go out and teach people. I don't think they knew. They were never taught. I honestly don't think it's a conspiracy. I think they didn't know. I don't think my professors willfully withheld something. The forces of what we record about what is happening, it just didn't quite make it, and people had a belief, well, it was good to have government. Hey, this stuff's all over, and let's not get into tax rates and stuff, and let's just move on.
Cadet King made the point that he wasn't taught he was taught in high school that FDR was wonderful and he had all these answers. That's commonly what people have been taught. And there's part of the reason for that is part of the progressive tradition. Their belief is that you put specialists in places of leadership. You use those specialists. Now, a lot of these specialists under Franklin Roosevelt were college professors, and they came up with the AAA. Rexford Tugwell, Raymond Moley, they were Columbia professors. And they're going to come up with, they are so smart, they're going to come up with all these ideas that just make society work. The problem is that most college professors have never worked out in the private sector. They don't know really how society works, and their ideas lead to big government spending and usually problems. But then the people looking at the results of those programs under the New Deal were other college professors. And were they going to really go at them and criticize them? Most didn't. So this poor factual basis got in textbooks, and it is in many, many people's minds now that that the New Deal worked, that it was a good thing, that government intervention is a very good thing. And the case in point, New Deal or Raw Deal came out in the fall of 2008, just as President Obama was elected.
Yeah.
2008. 2009, Burt was on a series of talk shows talking about New Deal or Raw Deal and going over the data and saying these programs did not work. Same week, a reporter goes up to newly elected President Obama and says, what about this criticism of the New Deal? And President Obama says, well, everybody knows the New Deal worked. And I thought, we are in big trouble.
Just to underscore something, and also, if they couldn't move fast enough with the New Deal programs because of potential legal problems or because of the Congress, you know what they did? Anybody have any idea what they did? They moved with judicial fiat. There was a great deal of impatience with our representative government, so they used judicial fiat to move what they believed proper forward, actually pushing aside representative government. We have time for about one or two more questions. Questions?
Well, that just reminds me of, didn't Wilson want to pack the court with his, FDR did.
Yes, he did.
1937. But Hoover, you mentioned him briefly about how he was a big spending Republican with the tariff. But wasn't he also criticized for not doing enough after the crash of 29? I remember people would invoke Hoovervilles of these tenement camps where people were forced to live. I was just wondering.
Roosevelt realized that he had to discredit Hoover, and so you really get an invented Hoover. Hoover, he couldn't very well say, well, we spent all that money and it didn't work, and I'm going to spend more. But you say, well, he didn't do as much as I've done, which is true, absolutely true. And he went into areas that Hoover didn't want to go. Hoover didn't want to go for a TVA. He didn't like that. Hoover didn't want to go for the National Recovery Act. And Roosevelt did. So Roosevelt went further than Hoover, and so Roosevelt's saying, in effect, next to me, Hoover was standing still. If only he would have moved fast, this would have been better. And so Hoover is miscast as a do-nothing. And really, the president that's closest to being a laissez-faire president, although he was, I'm talking about is Coolidge, although he did favor some high tariffs and there was some tinkering here and there, but Coolidge is the most limited government president and the one where we had the prosperity. I really think it's better to link Harding and Coolidge and then put Hoover and Roosevelt together.
I just saw Richard III this past weekend, the play, the Shakespeare play, and Henry VII deposed Richard III, end of the War of the Roses, for those of you who study British history. But as the historians go back and look at Richard III, a lot of what was said about him, including in Shakespeare's play, might not be all that accurate. As a matter of fact, the winners tend to write history. Mm-hmm. And the history is not accurately put down on paper by the winners. So be very careful. I am not a historian. I have the great privilege of being next to two great historians, but I am wary of historians in general because they make up history more frequently than they actually write down what happened. I want to thank our guests today for coming. They had a very tough trip here. They were supposed to get here a lot earlier.
But a very enjoyable trip.
They flew in the wee hours of the morning to be here with you today, and it's just such a pleasure to have them here, and I hope they'll come back many times in the future.
Thank you, Mallory.
Thank you.
Thank you.